so much. Okay. Wow. It's good to see everybody. I want to talk briefly, so I am talking a little bit about my book. The book is not out yet. You literally have the very first copies. The book comes out October 8th, and they got a special order of a box of books just for this conference, which is super cool. So I'm excited about that. What am I talking about today? The book covers a variety of different topics. It's primarily focused on why people are leaving religion and who's leaving religion. There is a secondary question: what happens when they leave? What do they do with their time? What do they believe? We'll cover all of those things in the book, so that's kind of useful. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today because I think all of you kind of know the answers to those things. So I'm going to focus on something else that's in the book. Here we go. That's the cover of the book. I think the slides are working now. Yeah, we can see it. Fun side note, if you can see the picture, that's actually my son. I took the picture inside a chapel, and if you look really close, there are exit signs, which I thought was great, so he's walking out of the chapel. That's probably the only time he's actually been in a chapel, by the way, which is kind of fun. Anyway, so very brief overview. Those are the primary questions that I wanted to mention. We're tackling those. Secondary questions, I'm going to skip over that. I do want to talk a little bit about the methods because this will actually come up in the presentation. The presentation is a bit number heavy. I told some people last night, if you're a numbers person, which I am, there are going to be a bunch of numbers in the presentation. So there are quantitative data in the book. There are qualitative data. My co-author, Jesse Smith, is a brilliant qualitative sociologist. He did most of the interviews, not all of them. But on the quantitative side, I just want to mention, we are comparing basically 3 groups throughout. We have 2 different data sets, so we have to use different groups in the different data sets. One of them is from the General Social Survey, it doesn't really matter, but we're comparing people who have left religion, people who were never religious, and then those who are religious, okay? You'll see a bunch of those slides. I'll explain those in a minute. The other one, I hate the data set. We can talk about it in Q&A, but we're comparing religious, not religious, and atheists, as though atheists are somehow separate from the not religious, but that's a problem with the data set. That's not our issue, so we'll deal with that. And then we do have some other surveys in the book. We'll talk about those in the qualitative interviews. Going to skip over a lot of this. What we're doing today, okay? You've left religion. You grew up without it. We're not going to focus on that. The very last substantive chapter in the book, chapter 6, tackles a different question, which is, what are the consequences of religious decline for society? Okay? And I think that's actually a very interesting question. It comes up a lot, not only in the work that I do, but in stuff that I've seen. So I do want to kind of bring this up, and we're going to wrestle with these questions a little bit today. To do this, we're going to play a little bit of a game. This is going to be more interactive. I'm a college professor, so bear with me. This is what we do, right? So how we're going to do this, I don't know how many of you have ever played the Have You Ever game, right? And maybe in very different contexts. We're not doing it in that context, right? This is in a very different context, right? But how we're going to do this is I'm basically going to put up a slide that says something like, have you ever, right? And then I'll kind of end that, right? So when I put that up, if you have in fact heard or seen something like this, I want you to stand up. If standing up is too much, you can always raise your hand, right? But it's going to be somewhat interactive. It's not like a Catholic Mass. You're not going to kneel at some point, right? So just standing up and then kind of sitting down. I just want to see how many of you have actually heard these claims, and then we're going to address each of those claims. So that's the idea. That's how we're going to play this. Does that make sense? Everybody good? All right, and again, you don't have to stand up. You can always just raise your hand. All right, so let's get started. Here's my very first one, and all of these questions are actually addressed in the book, except this first one, which is a bonus question that I threw in. The editors said we had too much. The book is very long, so they made us cut some of these. We're going to go to this first one. Have you ever heard non-religious people aren't as happy as religious people? If you've heard that, stand up. Okay, and I see some hands. Good. So some of you have not. You can sit back down. Thank you. We're going to be doing a lot of this, right? So. Just to give an illustration, this is actually from a report that I was a consultant on. I love Pew, like I really do. I like them a lot, but sometimes they get things wrong, even when I'm consulting with them. So I don't know if you can see this, but this is a report that Pew released a few years ago that said active religious people tend to be happier, okay? So this is widespread. It's out there, this idea that religious people are happier than non-religious people. Turns out that's bullshit, right? And I'm checking the monitor, right? I want to see if they actually if they put that up there. But you can see the numbers up here. So just walking through this, so you've got a sense. With all of these charts, we're using a statistical technique called average marginal effects. Doesn't really matter. But what it means is we're controlling for a bunch of demographic information. This is the right way to do things. So on all of these, we're controlling for age, race, sex, income, and education. But if you look, on this particular slide, it's just a question asking people, how happy are you? And at the bottom end, so 1 is very happy, 3 is not too happy. Okay? So it's just a 3-point scale. Turns out this correlates fairly well with happiness. But if you look on there, are there big differences? Are there meaningful differences? Right? There is a difference, but it's 0.1 on a 3-point scale. Those who care about statistical significance, it's not statistically significant, but I'm not going to focus on that. What I'm focusing on throughout this presentation today is just, are there differences? Do they look big? And what you see here, there is not a meaningful difference. In fact, I wrote an entire book chapter about this very question, looking at over 50 different countries around the world, and in the vast majority of them, there are no differences between the religious and the non-religious on how happy they are. Okay? It's just not true, right? There's no empirical evidence to support this. Occasionally, people will find ways to massage data to make that point, but it's just not true. The evidence don't bear it out. All right, you ready to stand up again? Let's see. Have you ever heard non-religious people are less likely to vote or volunteer or be civically engaged? Have you heard this? Stand up, raise your hands. Wow, a lot of you have not heard this. Surprising. Okay, sit back down. I'm going to give you an illustration of this from a very well-known book that came out about a decade ago, right? So this is a book called American Grace by Robert Putnam, the author of Bowling Alone, so a big kind of Harvard professor, and David Campbell, who is at the University of Notre Dame. Here is a direct quote from their book. In this chapter, we discover first that religious Americans are, in fact, more generous neighbors and more conscientious citizens than their secular counterparts. On the other hand, they're also less tolerant of dissent than secular Americans and important civic deficiencies. So they do admit that. Nevertheless, for the most part, the evidence we review suggests that religiously observant Americans are more civic and in some respects simply nicer. Okay? So I'm not making this shit up. This is what people think. People are making these claims, and these are big-name professors, and this was a best-selling book. So it's widespread that people are making these claims. Turns out, these are not true either. So let's look at the data. What do the data actually say on this, right? So again, I'm giving charts. I'll walk you through the charts. What do we have here? This is the predicted probability of someone being engaged or involved in an organization. And we're comparing 3 groups, religious, not religious, and atheists. So it basically ranges from like 0 to 1, right? 0, they're not going to be involved in the group at all. 1, they're definitely involved in the group. You'll notice none of these actually go above 0.7. So none of them are really that high. But I want to start with one because it should just like make sense. This is religion, right? So what do we see? There is, in fact, a difference. Religious people are statistically more likely to be involved in religions. Shocker. That makes sense, right? So we know this is working. The chart is working. Though, if you pay attention to it, it's only 35% chance. Isn't that weird, right? That's kind of surprising. So there are all sorts of little surprising things in there. But that's the only one where you actually find differences. Let's walk through some of the others. So I'm going to kind of reveal these in turn, right? This is sports organizations. So you belong to some organization that follows a sports team, something like that. Do you see a difference? No difference. Here's arts or educational organizations. Do you see a difference? Okay. Labor unions? Nothing. And political parties? No differences. Shocker, right? Putnam and Campbell were wrong. Let's keep going. We've got more evidence, right? I want to keep bringing evidence to bear on these questions. So here's our next one. This is same thing, different organizations, and I'm going to reveal these again, right? Assuming this is working. Here we go. So this is women's organizations. No difference. Self-help or mutual aid organizations, consumer advocacy groups, charitable organizations, professional organizations, and I'm a little sad about this last one. It rounds to 0. That's environmental organizations. Okay? So if you look at this, do you see differences? They're not there. Putnam and Campbell were full of shit, right? Their data were flawed. They cooked the books. They massaged the data. And I've actually shown this in some of my other research. All right, time to test another one. Have you ever heard non-religious people aren't as nice as religious people? You've all literally just heard this. You all should stand up or raise your hands, right? So there we go. We know. This is also to just give you a little exercise, right? So we're getting some exercise. As I thought about this, as my co-author Jesse Smith and I thought about this, we were thinking, like, what is the best way to actually really test this, right? What we came up with, and you could disagree with me, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want, is actually how nice people are, not to people like them, but to strangers, right? Because it's pretty easy to be nice to someone who's just like you. That's actually really easy. It's much harder to be nice to people you don't know or people who are very different from you. So these are some ChatGPT images. I like having them generate this, particularly for images like this next one, because it's creepy as hell. So we do know, right, this is a sociological principle. You're all creeped out by this, right? This should be a horror movie. This is great. The prompt was a lot of fun to generate. So there is a sociological principle called homophily. We tend to like people who are like us, right? That generally is true. We're comfortable being around them, right? But let's actually turn to the data and see who's actually nicer, right? Are there meaningful differences? And again, Putnam and Campbell said there were. Let's look at the data. So what do the data actually say on this? Again, we're coming right back to the data. Let's see what we've got. This is working. There we go. All right. So this is engagement in selfless acts. Okay. So there's a data set. This is, I think, the GSS. Yeah, this is General Social Survey, and it's asking people, how often do you do these things? And so if we're looking at the scale, 1 is more than once a week, 6 is not at all in the past year. So the higher the number, the less likely they are to do it. But this is engagement in selfless acts, and let's see if we see big differences here. So there's our first one, returning money after getting too much change. Do we see a big difference? I don't see a difference, right? This is giving blood. Turns out not a lot of people do, but no differences, right? Giving money to the homeless. Do you see big differences there, right? Try another one. Offering your seat to a stranger. Remember that stranger idea? There we go. No difference. Loaned an item of value to someone. And then our last one there, gave directions to a stranger. I'm looking for differences. Does anybody see differences in any of these charts, right? And if there are differences, they're minuscule. They're meaningless. We've got a few more. This is the probability of mentioning, and I like this one. I like this one a lot. This is the probability of mentioning that you don't want somebody to be your neighbor, okay? So it's an interesting kind of weird question. It comes from a different survey, so this is the World Values Survey. But it's basically like, hey, would you want this person to be your neighbor? Yes, no, okay? And what do we see? So again, we're kind of walking through this. This is drug addicts. I don't know if any of you would want drug addicts as your neighbor. Turns out they're not a very popular group, right? Most people don't want them as neighbors, but do you see a difference? No difference, literally no difference. Here's people of a different race. People who have AIDS, right? That is a question in there, right? Immigrants, homosexual individuals, people of a different religion, heavy drinkers. That one goes up much higher, right? So don't like heavy drinkers. Cohabiting couples, no one gives a f***. They don't care. It's fine, right? No one cares. Not even the religious care about this one, right? And then we have people who speak a different language. Are we seeing differences? No differences. I'm going to give you one more slide, right? So we've got one more slide where there is a little bit more of a difference, but look at the direction here. So I'll unpack it a little bit. But this is basically, so this next slide, is attitudes towards immigrants based on religion. And what you see, if you look closely at this slide, is the people who are most accepting of immigration are atheists. You can applaud for that, right? That's perfectly fine. So when Putnam and Campbell claim that religious people are nicer, there's no evidence to back that up. And in fact, if there's any evidence, it goes the other direction, okay? But this is, again, I'm not trying to make claims that, like, all of you are better than they are. That's not where we're going today, right? I'm trying to make the point, what do the data say? And the data do not seem to suggest big differences on most of these. All right, let's do this again. Have you ever heard people claim that non-religious individuals are less moral than religious individuals? Almost everybody's standing up on this one, right? Yeah, this is a pretty common claim. So pretty common. Again, you can sit down. Let's unpack this, right? And I will admit that this one is a bit more complicated than a lot of the other ones, okay? Why is this complicated? It turns out, even among the religious, they can't agree on what is moral and what isn't, okay? They can't, which I think is a lot of fun, and I'm gonna take just a minute to unpack that. I'm trying to be conscientious of time. I use this slide with my students all the time to illustrate that sin is a social construct. Who are my coffee drinkers? Who drinks coffee in here? Sinners! According to the LDS Church, you're all going to hell. Well, their version of hell, I don't really believe in hell. But it's kind of weird, right? Again, that's a ChatGPT image. I couldn't find actual missionaries in a Starbucks drinking coffee, which is great, right? But the idea is, amongst the religious, they have very specific things that they believe, right, are sins or immoral. But they don't even agree amongst themselves. So if we use the values and the morals of religious people to judge non-religious people, certainly they're going to be able to say, oh, you're less moral than I am. You guys drink coffee. That's absurd. It's stupid, right? It's a dumb argument. So really what we have to do is look for areas where we could kind of find universal agreement and then look to see where people actually fall. So that's the idea. Now I'm going to start by showing that those differences do exist. You're going to see this in the data, and then I'm going to show where they don't exist, right? So let's unpack this. This is views towards various behaviors among religious, non-religious, and atheists, right? And basically what it is, if you're looking at the scale, so if you care about the scale, at the bottom, one is never justifiable. So you can't do this, this is wrong, right? At the top, 10 would be always justifiable. So we're looking at a slight difference here. And then we're going to start unpacking these one at a time, right? This is homosexuality, and what do we see? Are there differences? Yeah, right? Who's most accepting of homosexuality? Not surprising, atheists and the non-religious, right? So we do know that there are differences. Let's try another one. That's prostitution. Another one, right? Non-religious atheists more accepting of this. These are actual differences, right? Sorry, mic's off. All right, abortion. No one should be surprised by that one, right? So big differences here. We've got a couple more. Divorce, same thing, big difference. Premarital sex, a big difference. Having casual sex, another difference. Suicide, a difference. Euthanasia, and then this last one where there isn't actually a difference is the death penalty. Okay? So as we look across there, this is where we see meaningful differences between religious and non-religious individuals, but it's because they have a different perception of what is moral and what is not. Now let's look at stuff that's probably more universal and see if we actually see meaningful differences. So same basic thing, different questions. Here we go. Claiming government benefits illegally. Are atheists a bunch of immoral individuals who are like, yep, absolutely going to cheat on my taxes, I'm going to do this, right? We don't see it. It's not in the data. It doesn't come out, right? Avoiding fare on public transit? I don't see a difference, right? Stealing, just stealing, straight up stealing property, no difference, right? Cheating on your taxes, that one's in there. Accepting bribes, no difference. Beating your wife? We actually did ask that, right? That's in the survey. Beating your kids, which there's a little bit of a difference, but I'm not going to make a big deal out of that one, right? We'll just leave that as it is. You guys saw it, right? And then our last one, violence against other people. So where we can find common ground, do you see big differences? They're not there, right? These claims that non-religious people and atheists are immoral just don't stand up to scrutiny. It doesn't make any sense. All right, let's try another one. Have you ever heard someone claim that non-religious people don't have family values? All right, so we got a bunch of you standing up again, right? It's a pretty common claim. Good, good. So this one I think is absolutely fascinating. We spend a lot of time unpacking this in the book, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but this is probably my favorite example of Orwellian doublespeak, if you're familiar with that phrase, right? This comes from 1984. Basically, what they're saying is, yeah, we have family values, right? This is the religious. We have family values so long as you look just like this, okay? If you are a straight heterosexual couple, you're white, you have 2 kids, and you live in the suburbs, and you have a white picket fence, and you agree with us on all of our family values, you can stay in our family. We appreciate you. But if you look like this, you're out. Does this make sense? Right? So when they say they have family values, it's only if you adhere to their perception of what family values are. So it's actually very much kind of doublespeak. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if we then ask people, okay, well, do you value family? Because we've asked this in surveys, guess what we find, right? So this is, again, different scale, very important to not at all important. So higher numbers, not at all important. And we're asking people about a variety of different things, right? So that first one is religion, shocker. Again, I have to put these on just to illustrate, like, this actually does work, right? We see that religious people are more likely to value religion. It's right there. Then we ask about something else. There's work. See a big difference in terms of valuing work? I don't see that difference, right? Politics, basically the same. Leisure time, pretty much the same. Then we get to the two, kind of the crux of this one. Friends, do we see a big difference in friends? Nope, they value friends about the same, and family. Can we really argue that religious people have more family values, that they value family more? I don't see it in the data. It's not there. This is another fallacious claim, okay? We've got a few more, and then we'll wrap up and we'll do Q&A. Have you ever heard someone claim that non-religious people will have fewer kids? Has anybody heard this one? So no one, we've got a few hands, right? So we got a few hands. Everybody's tired of standing up, so you're just like, I'm going to give a hand now. Just hands, right? So here's the fun one. That one's actually true. There you go. This is the one where there's an actually true claim, right? It's not a huge difference, but there is, in fact, a meaningful difference between the never religious, those who have left religions, and the religious in terms of the number of kids. Not a huge difference, but that difference is actually big enough that people have written quite extensively about this, and it leads to groups like Pew saying the reason why the non-religious are not growing globally is because we're not having as many kids as the religious. So it's literally just a fertility issue. If we look internationally, that's actually what's going on. Just kind of interesting, okay? So that one's actually very quick. That's probably the quickest one I have. Let's try this one. Have you ever heard someone claim that non-religious people are more likely to be nihilists and lack meaning in life? Got a bunch of people standing up on this one. Good. So you've definitely heard this one. All right. We have data, and then I'm going to unpack this a little bit because this one gets under my skin quite a bit. All right. So what do we have? This is general social survey data. This is not average marginal effects. I'm just going to show this. This is one of the questions that they ask. So this is agreement with a statement that life is meaningful only because God exists. Not surprisingly, right, the never religious and Exeters are like, no, that's not how this works, right? And religious people are like, yeah, definitely, this is why my life has meaning, okay? But luckily, in the general social survey, in that same survey, they ask a slightly different question, which is getting at something it's similar, right? And that is agreement with the statement, life is only meaningful if you provide the meaning yourself. And then what do we see? For the never religious and Exeters, do they agree with this? Yeah, to some degree. They're like, yep, that's pretty fair, okay? And the religious are less likely to agree with this. All of this is basically to say that it's not that there are huge differences in meaning between the religious and non-religious, right? There really aren't. There are some differences, but they're not huge. But more importantly, and this is where I kind of give my caveat, right? There's an important caveat. What I've just done, for those who care about this, is a bit statistical and wonky. We just used meaning as the dependent variable, okay? So we're basically saying, hey, are there differences in meaning based on religiosity? It's the dependent variable. If we flip that around and we say, okay, if people have meaning as the independent variable, what does that actually predict? Does it make people live longer? Does it make them healthier? Does it make them happier? Do they get more education? Turns out, it doesn't do any of those things. If you have lots of meaning, there's no difference for your physical health, your happiness, your mental health, your educational attainment. Nothing. Meaning makes no difference. It's meaningless, which is crazy to think about, right? But meaning doesn't actually matter. So there are no meaningful consequences from being a nihilist. right? Again, this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I am a nihilist. I fully embrace that, right? But conveniently, the data support this. All right. I think I have two more, and then we'll wrap up and we'll do Q&A. I'm trying to stay close to time. Next one. Have you ever heard? So we'll try this one. Someone claimed that non-religious people are more materialistic in the pro-consumption sense. Who's heard this? Not many. We got a few, right? So we got a few, right? That image that is the background there is not ChatGPT generated. Does anybody know what that image is of? That is Joel Osteen's 17,000 square foot home. Sorry, I had to put it in there, right? I was just like, wait, there are claims that we're the materialists? That guy. Anyway, moving on. So we have some data, right? Let's go ahead and look through the data. What do we got? This is willingness to sacrifice to help the environment among the never religious, Exeters, and religious, okay? So again, we're kind of looking at this. On this scale, 1 is very willing, 5 is not at all willing. What do we see? So we're looking at this. Would you be willing to pay higher prices to help the environment? Do we see big differences? It's not there, right? Pay higher taxes to help the environment? It's not there. And our last one on this, would you be willing to accept a cut in your living standards in order to help the environment? No differences, right? So these claims that non-religious people are more materialistic in a consumption sense, they don't bear out. There are a few studies that dig deeper into this, and most of them find that non-religious people are actually less materialistic in a pro-consumption sense. All right, I think this is my last slide here, or last set, right? I think so. I'll come to that picture here in a second. Have you ever heard someone claim that religious people are healthier than non-religious people? Okay, so we've got a few who are admitting this, right? This is another ChatGPT thing. This actually is courtesy of my wife. She has made this claim. We've co-authored a number of things. She's also a college professor. She's in public health. She says, you know, the only way that this would make sense is if they replace the pews in churches with exercise bikes. Okay? I finally got ChatGPT to generate that image. It's a little weird when you look at it, but she's not wrong, right? Like, why would we expect religious people to be physically or mentally healthier than non-religious people? What would actually do that? What would be the causal mechanism? There isn't one. There is no causal mechanism. So let's look at the actual data. This is self-reported health among religious, not religious, and atheists. Again, average marginal effects. And this ranges from 1 very good to 5 very poor. What do we see? Do you see differences? Are non-religious people less healthy? It's not there in the data, right? This is slightly different. This is days of poor physical health among never religious, Exeters, and the religious. Do you see a difference? Is not there. There's nothing going on, right? Days of poor mental health among the 3 groups. Do you see a difference? It's not there, okay? All right, that was a lot. I covered a lot. I didn't cover everything that's in the chapter. I should buy the book. But in conclusion, I'm actually going to give a direct quote from this. My co-author and I, Jesse Smith, Jesse's at Western Michigan University, as we finished the chapter, we were like, what are we actually saying? Like, what's the big takeaway? And I'm just going to read it because I think we wrote it fairly well, and I think that the point it's a pretty good point. So here's the actual conclusion from the chapter. We hate to think that this chapter is a disappointment, but we can imagine that it probably was for both the religious and the non-religious as they read it. We can fully understand the desire to see your side come out on top, to somehow be better than the other side. Tribalism is deeply ingrained in us as humans, but data are data. And what some might consider a disappointing chapter, we believe is actually a new perspective on people leaving religions. The simplest takeaway from this chapter is that everyone who is worrying about declining religiosity in the U.S. should relax. Thank you very much.
There's a decline in activity amongst social groups. The Elks, the Odd Fellows, the VFW, all of those groups are facing declines in membership. Why is religion any different or the same as in the United States? That is not just having the same sociological effect of less people partaking in social events.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of repeat the question and make sure I got it. So there are some declines in a variety of social groups, not all social groups, very specific social groups. And the question is religion really meaningfully different? And I would say actually it's not. In some of my research, I've made the point that basically religion is a leisure activity, which is weird to think about it that way, but that's actually who it competes with. So one of my studies, it's weird. I was invited by a colleague of mine who works at my university who goes to a pretty left-leaning Methodist church. They wanted somebody to just analyze some statistics for them about attendance. It was kind of weird. They wanted to see who the best pastor was. I don't know. That was weird. But they just didn't know how to do the statistical analyses. As I got into the data, I very quickly found that there were some seasonal trends in religious attendance, right? I live in Tampa, Florida. We have a professional football team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, right? One of the things that I started wondering was, does attendance go down on home days for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Anybody want to guess what the answer is? Yes, it does. Religions are now competing with places like professional sports, right? Those blue laws that existed for a long time, as those disappear, part of it, I mean, it's like auto-cyclical, right? So they kind of go hand in hand. But we know that religions are effectively a leisure form of, it's a form of entertainment now, right? So they are competing with other types of entertainment, not other religions per se, but other types of entertainment. And that's what's happening with a lot of these social groups, right? They have to compete. It is a marketplace. Part of the reason why we've seen a shift in the music and the style of worship is because they're trying to attract a different audience. One of the things I love pointing out with my students, traditional services happen at 9 a.m. on Sunday, contemporary services happen at 11 a.m. on Sunday, right? Why are they bumping back the contemporary service? Because the younger people were out on Saturday night. That's what's going on. So there is a marketplace, and religions are losing. They're losing in the marketplace. So I hope that answered the question. I'm happy to talk more about that. We have a question over here. Is the mic working?
I always try to answer these surveys, and I always have the same problem. I'm an atheist, almost lifelong. I'm also a Unitarian Universalist. I attend services almost weekly.
Yep.
Where do I fit? I feel like when I say I attend services, I bump up that number. I don't know what to do when I send emails and ask, nobody ever answers, so tell me.
No, that's great. That's great, right? So I totally get what you're saying, right? That it seems like there are contradictions in here. I've been at this sociology game for over 20 years now, and I've learned really one thing, and that's that humans are not consistent, right? They're not rational. We don't make a whole lot of sense. I like to point out that on any given Sunday in the US, about 1% of the people who are in church are atheists. Right? That throws my students off. It throws a lot of people off. They're like, what do you mean? Why are atheists in church? Some of them are Unitarians, right? That's totally true. But a lot of them have a spouse, and they're just going to support their spouse. They don't believe anything that's going on, right? They're just going to do this. So those inconsistencies, we love to get those as sociologists, right? It's actually helpful for us to say, hey, not everybody in church believes it, right? And we know that. So it's not a problem for you to say that. Now, I get that there are some problems with the wording. We don't typically allow people to choose multiple options, right, on religious affiliation. Here's the tricky part. Here's one where Pew actually got it right. Pew filled out a big survey where they asked people, like, hey, pick all that apply for religious affiliation. About 1% of people picked more than one, okay? The reason why we don't typically do that is it makes our analyses much harder. Right? So analyzing data where you get to pick multiple options just complicates the analysis. If it was like 50% of the population who were doing that, we would have to do that. It's like 1% of the population are like, well, I'm not religious, but I'm also this, right? Or I'm a Baptist and a Jew. Okay, sure, like that's fine. Like you do you, I'm fine with that, right? But it's such a small percentage that we often just kind of like don't worry about it. So it's totally fair, it's a good point.
Yeah, I wanted to ask on questions of like morality. You expect people to maybe lie on surveys as to how moral they are. How were the surveys conducted to prevent this? So
we actually, we take a slightly different approach in the book, okay? and I don't know if he's here, but so we have the survey data, we have interview data, but we also have federal data on prison inmates.
We do not have Wi-Fi.
Right? So
that's
if we're
why we
asking about morality, one of the easiest ways to get at who's more moral is who's in prison, right? Which I know not all the laws tie to morality, but it's another way to get around this, right? Atheists in the U.S., depending on the survey, depending on how you measure it, are somewhere between 6 and 20% of the population. Does anybody want to guess what percentage of federal prison inmates are atheists? It's 0.6%. Okay? So if we're getting at issues of morality, atheists are definitely not on the side of being far more immoral. Now, those data are even complicated as well because you get special treatment if you're religious in prison. We get that, like things are complicated. All we're really trying to argue at the end of the day is non-religious people are not more immoral, right? Do they have a different sense of morality? Absolutely. But on a lot of the things that we can all agree on, there are no meaningful differences. So it's a great question. I appreciate the question. I hope I answered it. Over here? Okay.
Thank you. I'm a big supporter of public education. And my question to you is, when I try to convince people who choose to attend charter schools, religious or other private schools, how can I provide them statistics or facts that would indicate that the students from public schools are better prepared for career in college when they graduate from high school?
Yeah, so we're a little bit on the edge of my area of expertise, but conveniently, there are some sociologists who have looked at the question of charter schools and private schools and whether those kids do as well as or better than kids in public schools. The research that I've seen suggests that they do not do as well as, they actually perform substantially worse. So there is research out there. Here's the tricky part. I don't know how many of you have access to the repositories that we use for publishing our scientific research, right? This is where the peer-reviewed journals are. Any big college or university will actually have access to that. So if you actually went to one of those libraries and said like, hey, I want to find research on this, I know the research exists. I've personally read it. It's just tricky like getting access to it because it's usually behind a paywall. And then you have to be able to read it, right? Which with books like this, I try and write for a general audience, but when I'm writing my journal articles, I'm writing using very technical language. So not everybody can understand everything that's in there, but certainly there's research supporting the idea that kids who go to charter schools do not do better. Generally, they do substantially worse, and then that's where you would find it would be in those journals. So I hope that answers it. We have a question over here.
Yeah. You, in your research, when you talked about the religious group, there's such a huge difference in the United States today about people who report as religious, from the very religious Christian nationalists to the very liberal, say, United Church of Christ or Unitarian Universalists. How did you make a distinction between those very different religious beliefs in the religious category?
Okay. Yeah, so I was just told this is the last question. Got to wrap up. In this particular book, we don't make those distinctions for the most part on the religion side, okay? People have done that for a long time. I think it's actually increasingly interesting and important to make the distinctions on the non-religious side, right? Not all non-religious people look the same, are very different. So in some of my other work, I've actually made those distinctions. In one of the books, I don't know if it's here, but it was mentioned, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. I draw very clear distinctions between religious groups. I'm fully aware of that, but in this one, we were trying to make just a very straightforward distinction between those who are not religious, two types, those who have left and those who are never religious, and just collectively the religious, right? But absolutely, there's plenty of research unpacking all the different ways that people can be religious. We just didn't do that very much in this book. That wasn't the focus, but it's a great question. And I think we're out of time.